The year is 1568. The dust of conquest still hangs in the air above Chittorgarh. Emperor Akbar's cannons have reduced the legendary Rajput fortress to rubble after a siege that lasted for brutal months. 30,000 Rajput warriors lie dead. 8,000 women have committed jauhar, mass self-immolation, choosing the flames over what comes next. But not everyone escaped that choice. Now, 3 weeks later, a veiled figure sits in an ornate palanquin, part of a victory procession winding through the streets of Delhi. She is a princess of Muir, daughter of a lineage that once ruled unconquered for centuries. Through the silk curtains, she catches her first glimpse of the Red Fort, its massive sandstone walls glowing crimson in the afternoon sun. To the cheering crowds, it is the heart of the empire, a symbol of Mughal magnificence. To her, it is a tomb she will enter alive. She doesn't know it yet, but she will never leave those walls. Not in 10 years, not in 30, not until death. This is the story of the Parada system, the Mughal Empire's most sophisticated machinery for processing the ultimate spoils of war, women of royal blood. This was no simple captivity. It was an intricate, methodical process that would strip these women of their faith, their names, their very identity, and transform them into permanent political instruments. A gilded labyrinth designed to obliterate the past and forge living symbols of submission. Many who faced this fate believed, with absolute conviction, that it was worse than death itself. By the end of this video, you'll understand why. The aftermath of every Mughal military victory followed a precise protocol. As the dust settled and the defeated kingdom's treasures were catalogued, gold, jewels, weapons, horses, another, far more delicate operation began. Specially appointed officers, men who understood the intricate hierarchies of enemy courts, moved through the ruins with a singular mission: identify and secure women of noble birth. Not servants, not commoners, princesses, daughters of Rajas and Nawabs, wives of defeated generals, women whose blood carried the weight of dynasties. This was no random pillaging. This was systematic, bureaucratic, coldly calculated. These women represented something far more valuable than gold. They were living, breathing symbols of the enemy's humiliation. To take a kingdom's princesses was to take its honor, its future, its very soul. Every Mughal commander understood this. The most prestigious trophy you could present to your emperor wasn't a sword or a crown. It was a veiled royal woman, her lineage impeccable, her value immeasurable. The selection process was ruthless in its precision. Genealogies were verified, bloodlines confirmed. The Mughals weren't interested in merely beautiful women. They wanted royal pedigree, the kind that would resonate across the subcontinent when news spread of who now resided in the imperial Zenana. For the defeated kingdoms, this was strategic devastation. These weren't just daughters and sisters being taken. They were potential mothers of future heirs, vital pieces in marriage alliances, living links to political legitimacy. Their capture didn't just end a war. It crippled a dynasty's ability to rebuild. The journey to Delhi or Agra or Fatehpur Sikri, wherever the emperor held court, was designed to be transformative in the cruelest sense. This was no mere transport. It was the first stage of erasure. The women traveled in covered palanquins or veiled howdahs atop elephants, segregated completely from the outside world. Heavy curtains blocked their view. Armed guards surrounded every conveyance, not just to prevent escape, though that was certainly part of it, but to ensure no unauthorized person even glimpsed the cargo within. These women were now imperial property, and their value depended on their inaccessibility. The psychological warfare began immediately. Torn from everything familiar, their homes, their families, their language, their gods, they were plunged into a void. No goodbyes, no explanations, no comfort, just the rhythmic sway of the palanquin and the knowledge that every step carried them further from everything they had ever known. The journey could take weeks. Imagine the isolation, the fear, the shame that came from understanding, even dimly, what your capture meant for your family's honor. Some women were barely teenagers, ripped from their mother's arms. Others were mature queens who had ruled alongside their husbands. None of that mattered now. At night, they camped under heavy guard in segregated tents. By day, they moved ever closer to the capital, where the real transformation awaited. They weren't told what would happen to them. They could only imagine, and imagination in such circumstances is a torture all its own. They arrived not as guests, not even as prisoners in any conventional sense. They arrived as raw material for the empire's most sophisticated system of control, women who would be methodically broken down and rebuilt into something entirely new. Step inside the Zenana, and you enter a world that defies simple description. This is no Orientalist fantasy of silk cushions and romantic intrigue. This is a prison, make no mistake, but one designed with a sophistication that most medieval fortresses could never match. The Zenana occupied vast sections of the imperial palace complex. In the Red Fort alone, it consumed nearly a third of the entire structure. But its true genius lay not in its size, but in its architecture of control. The layout was deliberately labyrinthine. Corridors twisted back on themselves. Courtyards connected through narrow passages that could be easily monitored. There was no direct route to anywhere. You couldn't simply walk from your quarters to a garden without passing through multiple checkpoints, each guarded by eunuchs who reported to a complex hierarchy of authority. The outer walls were patrolled by male guards who would be executed if they so much as attempted to look inside. The inner sanctums were controlled by eunuchs, men who had been castrated specifically to serve in this role, and by elderly women of proven loyalty. Every entrance, every corridor, every window was part of a security apparatus that would impress modern prison architects. But here's what made it truly inescapable. It wasn't designed to look like a prison. The walls were inlaid with precious stones. The floors were marble. Fountains played in the courtyards. The ceilings soared overhead, painted with celestial scenes. The cage was so beautiful, so comfortable, that the bars were almost invisible. Almost. The women inside knew. They understood that the intricate wooden screens, the jollies, that covered every window weren't decorative. They were there so you could see out, but no one could see in. They knew that the eunuchs who served them so obsequiously were also spies, reporting every word, every friendship, every whispered conversation to the Queen Mother or the Emperor himself. This was surveillance state architecture, centuries before the term existed. Every woman in the Zenana lived with the knowledge that she was always being watched, always being evaluated, always one mistake away from losing what little status she had managed to acquire. To maintain this gilded prison required an army of its own. The administrative machinery of the Zenana was staggering in its complexity and scale. At its peak under Emperor Aurangzeb, the imperial Zenana housed between 3,000 and 5,000 women. Not all were wives or concubines. Most were servants, attendants, guards, and administrators. But even this distinction was blurred because every woman inside those walls was, in some sense, a prisoner. The hierarchy was rigid and ruthlessly enforced. At the top sat the Queen Mother, the Emperor's own mother, whose word was absolute law within the Zenana. Below her were the principal wives, their status determined by birth, by the favor they enjoyed, and crucially, by whether they had born sons. Then came the secondary wives and concubines, ranked by a dozen different factors. Below them were ladies-in-waiting, companions, musicians, and dancers. Further down were the servants proper, women who cooked, cleaned, managed the accounts, tended the gardens. Running this required accountants, treasurers, and procurement officers. The Zenana had its own kitchen staff, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, its own physicians, its own teachers of music, dance, poetry, and religious instruction, its own tailors, jewelers, and perfumers. Every grain of rice, every bolt of silk, every stick of incense that entered the Zenana was recorded in meticulous ledgers. The budget for the imperial Zenana was larger than the annual revenue of many small kingdoms. This wasn't just about luxury, it was about control through complexity. The system was so vast, so intricate, that no individual woman could possibly understand or manipulate it. And that was the point. In this bureaucratic maze, you were utterly dependent. You owned nothing. You controlled nothing. Every comfort, every privilege, even every meal depended on the machinery that surrounded you. A machinery designed to keep you exactly where you were, comfortable, confined, controlled. The newly arrived captive, still reeling from her journey, was given no time to adjust. The erasure began immediately, and it began with the most fundamental aspect of identity: faith. Conversion to Islam wasn't optional. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't gentle. It was mandatory, immediate, and irrevocable. The woman, let's say she's a Rajput princess who has spent her entire life in devotion to Krishna or Shiva, who has performed puja every morning since childhood, whose very sense of self is intertwined with her Hindu identity, is brought before a mullah. The ultimatum is simple: convert or face consequences too terrible to name. Most chose conversion, not out of genuine conviction, but out of survival instinct and the crushing weight of hopelessness. The ritual that followed was designed to be symbolically devastating. The ghusl, the Islamic ritual bath of purification, wasn't just about physical cleansing. It was a baptism into a new reality, a washing away of everything that came before. As the water poured over her, she was told her old life was being cleansed. Her old identity dissolved. Then came the name. Her birth name, perhaps Padmini or Karnavati, names that carried centuries of cultural meaning, was discarded. She was given a new name, always Persian or Arabic: Mera Nissa, Mumtaz Mahal, Nur Jahan. Beautiful names, certainly, but not hers. Names chosen by her captors, names that marked her as property of the Mughal state. This wasn't mere religious conversion. This was juridical and spiritual obliteration. In the eyes of both Islamic law and Mughal bureaucracy, the person who had entered the Zenana ceased to exist. A new person with a new name, a new faith, and a new identity had been created in her place. For many women, this was the moment of true death. Their bodies lived on, but the person they had been was gone, erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. But the Mughals didn't stop at merely erasing the old identity. They were far too sophisticated for that. They understood that a truly effective instrument of power had to be carefully crafted, not just broken. What followed was an intensive program of re-education, a systematic reprogramming designed to transform a captured princess into a polished Mughal courtier. First came language. Persian was the language of the Mughal court, the language of power, poetry, and administration. The captive women were immersed in it, forced to abandon their native tongues. Tutors drilled them relentlessly. Within months, they were expected to speak, read, and write Persian with fluency. Their original languages, whether Rajasthani, Bengali, or any other, became dangerous to speak, markers of a past that was supposed to be forgotten. Then came culture. They were taught Mughal court etiquette, a complex system of gestures, forms of address, and social protocols that governed every interaction. They learned to move differently, to sit differently, to lower their gaze at precisely the right moment. Every aspect of physical behavior was scrutinized and corrected. They were instructed in Persian poetry and could be required to compose verses themselves. They learned to play instruments, the sitar, the tabla, and to sing classical ragas in the Mughal style. They were taught forms of dance that would entertain the emperor and his guests. They studied calligraphy, painting in the Mughal miniature style, even chess and other games favored at court. This might sound like education, like cultural enrichment. It was anything but. Every lesson was designed to replace what had been with what was desired. Every skill they acquired was a skill that served Mughal purposes. They were being polished, certainly, but polished the way you polish a weapon or a tool. The goal wasn't their development as individuals. It was their perfection as instruments of imperial policy. By the time the process was complete, months or years later, the transformation was total. The woman who emerged spoke Persian, practiced Islam, responded to a Mughal name, and had thoroughly internalized the behaviors expected of her. She had become, at least outwardly, exactly what the empire needed her to be. But inside, in the private corridors of memory and identity, what remained? That's a question the Mughals never bothered to ask. The Zenana wasn't a retirement home. These women, once fully processed, became the empire's most valuable political currency. The Mughal Empire was vast, stretching from Kabul to Bengal, from Kashmir to the Deccan. Managing such an enormous territory required more than armies. It required a network of loyal nobles, generals, and administrators, men who commanded their own forces and controlled their own regions. These men were powerful, potentially rebellious, and constantly needed to be bound to the throne. The most effective way to bind them? Marriage. The emperor held the ultimate card. Women of royal blood, now Muslim, now bearing Mughal names, but still carrying the prestige of their original lineages. To bestow such a woman in marriage was to grant a noble the highest possible honor. It said, "You are not just a servant of the empire, you are family." These marriages were calculated with mathematical precision. A powerful Rajput general whose loyalty was wavering? Grant him a woman originally from a rival Rajput clan, demonstrating your power to bestow even your enemy's nobility. A Persian nobleman whose support you need for a critical campaign? Gift him a woman of impeccable subcontinental royal blood, weaving him deeper into the fabric of the empire. The women had no say in these arrangements. One day, they might be summoned and informed they were to be married to a man they had never met, perhaps decades older, perhaps younger, always a stranger. The wedding would be lavish, public, a demonstration of imperial generosity. And then they would leave the Zenana for their husband's household, exchanging one form of captivity for another. But here's the cruel genius. Even after marriage, they remained instruments of imperial policy. They were expected to report back on their husband's activities, their loyalties, their conversations. They were spies, whether willing or not. The empire had made them Mughal, and it never let them forget what that meant. For women who remained in the imperial Zenana as wives or concubines of the emperor himself, a different game began, one even more dangerous. Bearing a son to the emperor was the only path to real power within the Zenana. A woman who gave birth to a prince became instantly elevated. She received larger apartments, more servants, greater allowances. Most importantly, she gained political significance. Her son might become emperor, and if he did, she would become the next queen mother, the most powerful woman in the empire. But this prize came wrapped in existential danger. The Mughals had no clear law of succession. When an emperor died, his sons typically fought a brutal civil war for the throne. This meant every prince was a potential emperor, and every prince's mother was desperately invested in her son's success. The Zenana became a nest of rival factions, each centered around a different woman and her offspring. The stakes were absolute. If your son won, you became the power behind the throne. If your son lost, you and he would likely be executed, blinded, or imprisoned for life. The weapons in this warfare were poison, assassination, intrigue, and alliance building. Women cultivated relationships with powerful nobles outside the Zenana, sending messages through trusted eunuchs. They maneuvered to have rival princes sent away on dangerous military campaigns. They spread rumors, undermined rivals, and positioned their sons for advantage. Paranoia was justified. History is filled with Mughal princes who died under suspicious circumstances. A sudden illness, a fall from a horse, a plate of poisoned food. And behind many of these deaths were the machinations of women in the Zenana, desperately fighting for their sons' survival in the only way they could. This was the ultimate irony of the system. Women stripped of everything, denied every freedom, could still wield enormous power, but only through their sons, and only at the constant risk of losing everything, including their lives. Try to imagine it. You are 20 years old, raised in a royal court, educated, perhaps even politically astute. You've known purposeful activity, meaningful relationships, the rhythms of a life that made sense. Now you sit in a room of breathtaking beauty. The walls are inlaid with lapis lazuli and carnelian. The carpet beneath you cost more than a village could earn in a decade. Servants anticipate your every need. You want for nothing material, and you will sit in this room or one very like it for the next 40 years. This was the core horror of the Zenana. Not the violence, not the conversion, not even the political machinations, but the crushing weight of endless, purposeless time. These women, especially those who never caught the emperor's eye or never bore sons, lived lives of absolute idleness wrapped in absolute luxury. They had no responsibilities, no decisions to make, no meaningful work to occupy their days. They couldn't leave. They couldn't travel. They couldn't even choose their own company with any real freedom. Days blurred into months, months into years, years into decades. The same courtyards, the same faces, the same empty routines of bath, prayer, meals, and sleep. Some took up elaborate hobbies, poetry, painting, music, but these were distractions, ways to fill the void, not genuine purpose. The psychological toll was devastating. Modern psychology has documented what happens to people in prolonged confinement, even comfortable confinement. Depression, anxiety, a slow dissolution of the self that comes from having no impact on the world, no agency, no meaningful existence beyond survival. The Mughals provided everything except the one thing these women most desperately needed: freedom. The freedom to make choices, the freedom to have purpose, the freedom to exist as full human beings rather than as beautiful objects in an imperial collection. Many went mad. Some took their own lives. Others simply faded, becoming ghosts who haunted the Zenana's corridors, alive but not living, breathing but not truly existing. But perhaps the deepest cruelty, the most profound loss, was one that played out across generations. For the women who did bear children, especially sons, there was a terrible irony. They had created life, but that life would never truly be theirs. The children of the Zenana were raised as Mughals, pure and absolute. A boy born to a former Rajput princess and a Mughal emperor was not half Rajput. He was fully Mughal. His mother's heritage, her family's history, her people's traditions, all of it was deliberately erased from his education and identity. The mother might try, in private moments, to tell her son about her family, about the kingdom that had been his grandfather's, about the heritage that flowed in his veins. But those stories were discouraged, even forbidden. They were dangerous. They represented loyalty to something other than the Mughal throne, and that could not be permitted. As the boy grew, he was taken from his mother's direct care and placed under male tutors. He learned Persian, not his mother's native language. He studied Mughal history, not his mother's people's history. He was taught to see the world through Mughal eyes, to understand his identity as purely Mughal. By the time he reached adulthood, his mother's heritage was, at best, a footnote. More often, it was completely forgotten, deliberately bred out through the systematic erasure of cultural transmission. For the captive mother, this was the ultimate defeat. Her bloodline continued, yes, but it continued only as part of the empire that had destroyed her home. Her grandchildren would be Mughals who might one day lead armies to conquer kingdoms like the one she had come from. Her great-grandchildren would have no idea that their ancestor had once been anything but Mughal. She had been absorbed. Her lineage had been conquered more completely than any army could manage. And she had to live with that knowledge year after year, decade after decade, watching her own descendants become instruments of the very empire that had made her a prisoner. This was genetic imperialism at its most sophisticated. The Mughals didn't just conquer territory, they conquered bloodlines, transforming enemy nobility into Mughal nobility, ensuring that even the most prestigious families of the subcontinent became, over generations, part of the imperial structure itself. Walk through the Red Fort today, and you'll see what the tourists see. Magnificent architecture, beautiful gardens, remnants of a glorious empire. The signs will tell you about the emperors who lived there, the battles they fought, the monuments they built. They don't tell you about the Zenana. Not really. Not in the way that matters. The Parada system was more than a policy. It was the ultimate expression of imperial dominance. The power to not just conquer a kingdom, but to systematically dismantle its most sacred symbols. To take royal women, the vessels of dynastic continuity, the mothers of future kings, and transform them into bricks and mortar for your own empire's expansion. It was brilliant in its way, monstrous but brilliant. By converting, marrying off, and breeding with the daughters of conquered kingdoms, the Mughals turned their enemies' own royal bloodlines into supporters of Mughal rule. Potential rebels became relatives. Dynastic rivals became distant cousins. The very families who might have opposed the empire became invested in its survival. But brilliance doesn't erase horror. These were human beings, women with dreams, ambitions, beliefs, and identities, systematically destroyed and rebuilt as tools of state policy. Their suffering was individual, intimate, and prolonged. Not the sharp pain of battle, but the slow agony of erasure, stretched across decades, across entire lifetimes. So here's the question I leave you with. Was the Parada system a coldly brilliant, if monstrous, strategy for political consolidation? Or was it one of history's most sophisticated and prolonged forms of psychological torture, disguised as privilege and presented as honor? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps that's what makes it so disturbing, that something so cruel could also be so effective, that the gilded cage could serve imperial purposes so perfectly precisely because it was so inescapable. The women who lived and died in the Zenana left few records in their own words. Their stories were written by the empire that held them captive. But if you listen carefully to the silence in those beautiful, empty courtyards, you can still hear the echoes of lives lived in golden chains. If this journey into history's darkest corners has affected you, leave a comment below with your thoughts. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into the stories that textbooks often skip. And hit that notification bell because next time we're going even deeper into the machinery of empire, the human cost of conquest, and the forgotten voices that still echo through history's palaces. Until then, remember, the most beautiful prisons are still prisons.